Let's use Blender to sculpt some tabletop gaming terrain. Welcome everybody. If we haven't met before, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield, and today I figured we would do a fairly simple introduction to sculpting in Blender. We're going to be working on these terrain pieces right here. They're kind of sculpted stone pillars, and hopefully this tutorial will be relatively easy to follow. Now, the one thing to know here, this is not like your very first Blender tutorial. The assumption I'm making is that you have some basic understanding of Blender, its UI, and the keyboard commands. So you know how to move meshes around, vertices, what all that stuff is. You just may be new to the sculpting process. So with that, let's jump over to Blender. Now let's jump right into a new scene here in Blender, and we're going to work with the default cube. So I want to make my stone pillar be about a little over an inch by maybe 2.5 inches tall. So let's press N to open up our settings. And our dimensions over here, those are all going to be in millimeters. So let's say 32 by 32 by about 75. So that's about the dimensions that I just mentioned. Now I'm going to apply some beveling to the standing edges as well as the top 4 edges. Before I do that, I need to do something called apply scale. So with the cube selected, do Control A and choose apply scale. This changes some scale values over here, but more importantly, it's a behind the scenes math thing. So operations from this point, such as beveling, and in a bit here, sculpting, are affected by the scale of the object. So by applying this, it makes those things work more normal. Let's jump into edit mode. And I want to go to edge select mode here in the upper left hand corner. And I want to select the 4 standing edges. So just shift left click all in a row. And then do the same thing for these top 4 edges. Press Control B and immediately left click. Let's go down to bevel here. And let's just change some numbers. For the offset, I'm going to punch in a number like 2. So that's about 2 millimeters of a bevel. Of course, right now it's kind of blocky. So change the segments. We'll increase this number to like 5. And that gives you something a little bit more rounded. You know, that's probably a little bit too big. Let me go to 1.5 bevel. There we go. I think that'll be all right. Now, you know, let's go 1. Oh dear, wrong number. 1. Now it's time to jump into sculpting and build the rock texture of the column here. And for that, I want to use some sort of reference image. So let me bring in 2 reference images by going Shift A, choose Image, Reference. And you have to bring the images one at a time, it seems like. So I've got my 2 images brought in here. These are some examples of late 19th century architecture. They're both from Rochester, Michigan. The top here is a column that's left over from a house that existed back in the late 19th century. And then down the bottom here is an example of a dam that was built around the same time. In fact, the lake and the dam here are owned by the person who owned this. And if you want to get a copy of these 2 images as references for a stone column, head over to tabletopbattlefield.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to the video over there where you can find these images for download. Let's jump over to sculpting mode. So I'm going to jump to the sculpting tab up here at the top because I have some things already set up ready. Oh dear goodness, let's zoom out. Okay. By swapping over to the sculpting layout, it automatically switches Blender into sculpt mode, but there are a few things we want to change. In our brush settings, we want to enable dynamic typology. Just hit OK. And then expand it out for detail size. We'll go with 3 pixels. This will create a very detailed, messy mesh, but it's alright for what we're doing right now. You can clean that up later if you want to go on beyond this tutorial. And then for this one, we want to turn off symmetry. So expand symmetry. Right now, mirror X is selected. Left click that, turn that off because we don't want to mirror things across the X axis. That feature is great for if you're modeling like organic creatures and you want to make the 2 sides of their body be identical. So from this point on, I'm going to jump over to a tablet that I have, but you can use a mouse if you want. I just find that with some experience, using a tablet for sculpting in Blender is a little bit easier. There we go. Except it can do kind of wonky stuff like that. So our first step is to block out the basic shapes of the stones in the stone pillar. And for doing that, I'm going to use the crease tool over here. And one note as you start sculpting. With miniatures, you need to exaggerate detail. So detail is not actually done to scale. If you do detail to scale, it'd be so small you wouldn't see anything. So with the strength of about 0.75, a radius of 10 pixels, I'm going to start drawing the basic shapes of the rocks. And there really isn't anything fancy to here. I'm just kind of looking at the images and drawing approximately what I see. The one thing I am trying to avoid are small, sharp angles, but if you get things like this, just kind of fill them in with a smaller rock. There we go. And then slowly we're going to build up the detail of the column. And then when I've got one face done, I'm going to repeat the process for the 3 other side faces, as well as the top, ensuring the lines on the side match from basically face to face. We've got a pretty good starting point for our stone column here. What I want to do now is go in and find some of the kind of oopsie areas, like right here we got weird jagged things going on, and clean those up a bit. I'm going to turn into one of these areas on the column to where there's a lot of mortar, more so than the rocks are not right next to each other. To create that effect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually work with the clay strips, but instead of adding material, I want to subtract material. So I'm going to go over to the direction and brush settings, choose subtract, and just kind of clear out some space in there. We'll make it look a little bit nicer later. And we'll just put a few of these areas all over the wall. Now we're going back to what I talked about a little bit ago, where I say you have to exaggerate detail. So I really want to make these creases between the stones nice and deep so you can for sure see them on your miniature and that they stand out. So we're going to go back to the crease tool. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, so let's zoom in. And then crank up the strength back up to say like 0.75. Let's see how this looks. That looks good. And now go over and retrace all the outlines around the rocks. Now keep in mind you can always go back and kind of knock this down a little bit if you do end up printing the miniature and you think that, this is a little bit too intense. So you can knock this effect back down. But more often than not, you're going to be happier with the extra intense detail. At this point, you might notice your computer is kind of struggling a bit, because what is happening is that dynamic typology feature I had you turn on at the beginning is giving Blender a free license to add as much detail and as much complexity to this object as it needs to create the design you're trying to make. The downside, if you look in the lower right hand corner here, your triangle count, which is a way of representing the amount of detail in your miniature, is skyrocketing. I'm at 1.8 million triangles, which is huge. So we need to knock that down a little bit before we can continue working on this object. So I'll press Tab, and this will take us out to object mode after Blender's done struggling. Hopefully not crashing. Oh, nope, sorry. Tab takes you to edit mode, even worse. Actually, press Tab to return to sculpt mode. So what we need to do is in the upper left-hand corner here, instead of sculpt mode, let's go to object mode. We're going to go to our modifiers context, which is a little wrench over here on the right-hand side of the screen. This is called modifiers property now. It was like context in like 2.8, 2.81. Anyway, regardless, add modifier, and we want to choose decimate. Now, decimate reduces the amount of vertices in the mesh and basically therefore knocks that geometry and the detail back down a little bit. This will cause some loss of detail, a little bit loss of fidelity and the quality of things. But for the most part, it doesn't really affect your mesh a whole lot, especially when you got something like this where exact detail is not super important. So for the ratio, I'm going to actually drop this thing down to about 0.15. So I'm basically telling Blender, keep 15% of my vertices. Hit enter, let it do its thing, and we'll see what we're left with. And there we go. It still looks pretty good to me. If for some reason you think this doesn't look good to you, nothing has actually changed with your object yet. You can go back, change the ratio value, crank it back up to 1, and you're good to go. But you'll notice now for me, my triangle count is down to 274,000. I got rid of about 1.6 million triangles right there. Awesome. All right, I'm going to hit apply. And once that is done, I'm going to continue the sculpting process. Now the next step is to basically dirty things up a little bit and make the rocks look a little bit more, well, rocky. If you look at the reference images over here, well, the rock surfaces are all kind of just beaten up, chiseled, definitely not smooth or flat. So we're going to give something that gives that idea to these surfaces over here. So we'll jump back into sculpt mode and, well, we're going to add some clay strips. To add the clay strips, first make sure dynamic typology is turned on. Sometimes certain operations in Blender can turn this off. And then earlier we were using subtract on clay strips. Go back to add, and then I'm going to bump down the strength a fair bit. And you can see just basically scribbling some clay strips on each of the rock faces. And I'm intentionally trying to make them somewhat uneven. So you don't want just like, a little bit of clay in one across the entire area. You want some areas that have a little bit more clay than others. So there's the first step of this process done. Now we're going to go back to subtract mode for the clay strips and remove a little bit of area off each of the rock faces. I'm going to change my brush size a little bit. And let's go ahead and just do more scribbling. So at this point, it looks like what we've done in the rocks is scribble a bunch of clay strips on them, because that's all we've done. But what we have accomplished is that we have created the volume of each of the rocks. Sculpting in Blender is usually a two-stage process. The first is to create the volume of the object you're trying to sculpt, and then redefine it so that it's a nice clean-looking shape. So in this case, for rocks, since they're kind of flat, jagged things, we're going to use the Flatten tool. And I'm going to go over each of these rock faces with the Flatten tool to kind of give them more of an uneven but jagged look to them. Now at this point here, we've been going between the two brush directions by using the brush settings over here on the right hand side. But what you can also do is press Control while you're sculpting, and that'll use the inverse direction. This allows us to quickly switch between, in this case, flatten and adding contrast. So I got flatten selected over in the brush settings. I'm going to go over the rock face a little bit with the flatten tool, and then periodically going to press Control to go to the contrast mode and then bring out some of these sharp edges that remain. What this will do is it'll keep sort of more or less the volume of the rock we created, but it gets rid of a lot of the scrapey edges produced by adding clay strips on top of each other. But at the same point, it's going to enhance several of those, just like you would expect to see in an actual rock texture. All right, let's do this to all the rocks on our particular column here. Looking pretty good, but one thing we want to do is, well, it's not looking rickety enough. So we bring up our reference images again. What you can often see is, well, the sides of these columns, they're not exactly smooth, especially if you go up here and when they're worn down a little bit, they're kind of just, well, just a little off. Whereas here, our piece has fairly straight sides to it. So what we're going to do is use one of the most dangerous sculpting tools in Blender to kind of make the column a little bit less nice and straight. Select the grab tool over here on the left hand side, scale it up to a nice large tool setting, and then very carefully you're going to pick areas along the side of your column here to move either outward or inward to make it a little bit more just worn down looking. Now the grab tool, I call one of the more dangerous tools with sculpting. It's very easy to do something like this. And well, that's bad. So the way you avoid that is by making very, very small movements with the tool. Things like that and like that. So you can see how I'm just kind of going down the side here, and I'm just making very, very small movements with the grab tool. And all this does is it just makes the various sides be less even. Do the same thing to the face of the columns and kind of move in some of the rocks, pull some out a little bit, and that will also help add a little bit of that worn down kind of character to the entire piece. Then I'm going to zoom in, we're going to scale my tool down a bit, and we'll do the same thing now, basically with a smaller tool. We're going to make more kind of smaller indentations and extrusions instead of large changes. To sell this effect even more, I'm using what's called the scrape tool. This allows me to actually remove material from the corner of these stones and help sell the whole story of wind, water erosion, and other elements of nature that have just taken their toll on the stone column over the hundreds of years it's been standing. And with that, we're nearly complete with this terrain piece. The last thing I want to do is actually make it hollow, because I'm going to be printing this guy out on a resin printer. So let's return to our layout mode up here in the top. I want to make sure I'm in object mode. Right now we are in perspective wireframe, which is fine. But I want to press 5 to go to orthographic mode. And I'm going to add a new mesh, which is going to be a cube. And you see it up here. I want to scale this up such that in each direction it's just a little bit smaller than basically the smallest areas of the pillar. Except in the Z direction, I want to make sure it's taller, but it's sticking out the bottom like that. So you can see here now how from this view, the rectangle is a little bit smaller than the width of the column. If I jump to my other view, I'm going to move it and we're going to scale it along this axis so that it is just a little bit smaller. And therefore it's just kind of inside the column a little bit. Let's call this guy empty space. So I'm just changing the name over here in the object properties. I'm going to click on my column, which is currently called cube. Let's call this column. And then I'm going to perform a Boolean operation under the modifier properties. So add modifier, choose Boolean. Operation is difference. The object is going to be empty space. And let's see what happens. I think that might be good. Doesn't look too bad. So let's apply that. I am going to press H, hide the empty space. Let's go back to solid mode, look in this thing. And you can see now it's more or less hollow with only, it's sort of thin walls, but it'll work fine for the terrain piece. Now comes the most dreaded part. Are there any non-manifold vertices? Excellent, there's none. I don't gotta teach you how to do that. Non-manifold vertices are an error condition. I'll put a link in the show notes if you do ever run into these things, how to fix some of them. But this guy is just about ready for export. In edit mode here, I'm going to select everything. I'm going to do Shift N, which will do a magical behind the scenes math thing. And then I can export this guy and you can print it up in any slicer of your choice. When exporting an STL file in Blender, be sure to choose this selection only box right here. It might be on the right or the left depending on the layout of your screen, but if you don't choose that, it'll export everything else in your scene, which usually is not what you want. And there we go. Once you get these guys printed out on your resin printer, you got some really nice looking 3D printed terrain for your tabletop battlefield. Hey, I said the name of my show. I assume it's not a mystery where that comes from, but you never really know, you know. But anyway, with that, thank you guys all for watching. Once again, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. If you like these kind of videos where we look at Blender for tabletop gaming, robotics, Battletech, Warcaster, all that fun stuff, go ahead and hit subscribe here on this YouTube channel and get the latest videos. Well, actually, I hit notifications too, or the bell icon if you want to get when they come out. Otherwise, YouTube may show it to you once. If you don't watch it once in a small channel, it'll throw it away forever, because that's how YouTube works. Kind of maddening. But, you know, it takes time to build up a channel, all that fun stuff. So, with that, have a great week, guys.